extravaganza around the corner, hosted by Publication Board Assam. The third session of Third Brahmaputra Literary Festival is about post-war literature in Vietnam. Today's topic aims to focus over the past 3 decades with Vietnam's literature. Vietnam's renewal since 1968 has reshaped a national culture and inspired artists' creativity. Many literature works awaken the public to the problems of economic reforms and changes of social ethics through a wisely analytical and critical attitude. The renewal period saw the emergence of female writers who breathed a new life into literature with their feminine sensitivity. If during the wartime a generation of writers basically fulfilled their historical responsibility, after the war, the subsequent generations helped form an eventful literary period, winning the hearts of the audience. Without any more delay, I would like to welcome our eminent speakers on the dais. Nguyen Ki Duc, a radio broadcaster, writer, editor and translator. He has been a radio producer and writer since 1979, working for the British Broadcasting Corporation in London and a KLW-FM in San Francisco, and as a commentator for National Public Radio. Quan Berry, a creative writer and professor. She is among a handful of writers who have received National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in both fiction and poetry. Nguyen Thai Hang is a writer, poet, and a visual artist. Her first trilogy, Current Times, Good Sensations, and Reasonable Insanity, written during a 2-year adventure in USA. Her works often combine various art and forms, large-scale sculptures, installations in contemporary dance, cinema, fine arts, and music. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for our guest speaker for the day. I would now request our moderator to proceed with today's interesting session. Thank you. Before we begin, I would like to request all the audience to keep their cell phone in silent mode. Thank you.
Good afternoon. There's nothing I like more than having a session right after lunch when everybody's a bit hot and a little bit sleepy. We'll try to keep it awake and keep you awake for the duration of the talk. I'm grateful for Amy and for Thuy Han to join me today. I call you Amy. Amy will wrap up the talk with some of the writing from Vietnamese who've left the country since the war. Thuy Han will talk more about more current period, and she mentioned about women writing, her own writing as a woman, but she's also a visual artist that I'll explain a bit more. One thing, whenever we travel anywhere, or when we talk to other people outside of the country, we have trouble trying to explain to people that Vietnam is not a war, and that when people think of the war in Vietnam, they think of the war with the Americans, or against the Americans. But remember that after the war with the Americans, there have been other wars with Cambodia, with China, and before that there have been other wars in the 20th century. What I'd like to do is focus on a particular period after the war, if we can have the next slide, which culminates in about 10 years of Vietnamese writing that was at that particular time the most expression is the most free writing at all. Remember that before this period, Vietnam was under the control of the communists, who had very particular ideas as to what writers could do and could write about. And it's modeled on the socialist realist thing, where everybody who participated in the war was a hero. But there was no way to describe these other people than this hero who believed in the party, who believed in the war, who believed in the causes. And then when the Communist Party took over all of Vietnam and won the war, they carried out these very rigid, dogmatic, doctrinaire policies which gave Vietnam a period of incredible poverty. And then they finally realized they needed to change. Can we have the next slide? So the next change happened in Vietnam around 1986. And it was a restructuring of the policies of Vietnam, both economically, culturally, and so they modeled it after, or they preceded the Soviet Union and Perestroika in changing the way that the government ran the country and what people could talk about. In Vietnam, it was called renovation, and it started around 1986, although a couple of years before that, they'd already talked about private enterprise, allowing people to do their own things instead of being dictated by the authorities. So with the political restructuring in Vietnam, they were beginning to think, how do we get various regions of Vietnam to produce, to allow them a voice, to allow them a chance to do the things that they needed to do, instead of the 5-year plan, like in the Soviet Union and other countries in the West, Eastern Europe. And so the political restructuring started happening, and they changed the economic liberalization of Vietnam. They allowed private enterprise. They reduced the support from the government, but they allowed the people to produce their own rice, their own food, and they made bureaucratic reforms. That was around 1986. With that, there was a relaxation of culture control. No longer was the party that much in control. It was 100% control. Before that, if you had a painting you wanted to do, you had to submit it to the artists' union, or if you wanted to write something, you have to submit your stories to the writers' union. They allow you to print a book, to write a book, they censor you, and say this will not be allowed. After this, there was a moment when the Vietnamese could write and could tell the different stories. It changed the way that the media worked. It allowed a lot of organizations to happen without the state control, arts organization and other private things. And they allowed different expressions within Vietnam. So the state, or the power of the government, began to loosen up the control, and they walked away from socialist realism in the writings of the people, and it wasn't about propaganda anymore, because before that it was all propaganda that the party had led the people to fight against the French and the Americans, and there was no one else. Now the voices of the people, the individuals who fought in the war, was beginning to change, including some moral standards, the way we described ourselves in more realistic terms. 3 stories stood out from that period that discovered the oddities of the war. And these are my choosing, but I thought these were the 3 stories that had a real good impact on changing views of the war. It wasn't heroes. I'll begin with No Horizon, which is about a group of people sent to the jungle to grow food for troops and soldiers who came by during the war. And to keep it short, there was one woman involved in this group. When the war ended, nobody knew that the war had ended, and these 5 men wanted to go home to the village and the woman, except that now the woman is pregnant, and we don't know who the father is. And that was the beginning of saying, oh, the war wasn't all rosy, wasn't all good, now what do we do with this? The same thing happened with 5 heroes. A mother, after the war, had gone to look for the bodies or the remains of her son who fought in the war, and she spent 2 years, she couldn't find the bodies, nobody helped her. And then when she found out where the son had been buried, she wanted to take the body home to her home village to bury according to traditions, except that now he's buried with 4 other comrades who fought in the war, and it's now a monument there. And the government would say, no, you can't just take the body back, because it's a ceremony, or it's a monument for 5 heroes. can't make it 4. So the woman fought for years and couldn't bring her son's remains home. And Please Don't Knock is another beginning where they talked about the effect of the war on the individuals who fought in the war. A man who'd been assigned as an assassin in the South went to war as an assassin. Whenever he knocked on the door of somebody's house, he would come in and kill the person. After the war, he came back to his home, and he began to have traumatic experiences where anybody who knocks on his door, he would kill that person. So his wife had to put a sign up on the door saying, "Please don't knock." So at that point, these stories began to tell the stories that were more humane. It's about the effect of the war on the average person. It wasn't about the ideology, it wasn't about winning the war. It's about the losses suffered by the people. Two particular people stood out around that time, and I give them credit for opening up this kind of freedom of expression in Vietnam. Very courageous at this point. Minh Châu was a high-ranking official in the army, but he wrote stories that depicted oddities again, because the war in Vietnam was not just a war against the Americans, it was a civil war between the North and the South. And he depicted cases where brothers fought on different sides of the border. He told those stories, and that was a very particular stories that broke the rules and allowed people to think, oh, there was fighting amongst brothers. Hoàng Ngọc Hiến was a civilian, but he founded the School of Writing in Hanoi, of Nguyễn Du writing schools. A lot of people came out of the Nguyễn Du school. In the very beginning, Nguyễn Du's school was a state-sponsored school. It was a government school, but Hoàng Ngọc Hiến changed it and encouraged people to write about the truth in Vietnam. And he was the one person who wrote an essay about the writing that's called the correct writing, almost like religiously correct in a sense that we have to stop the propaganda, we have to stop doing the ideologically correct stories and allow people to say what went on during the war and what is true and what is happening now in the country. So he's a key figure in changing the situation in Vietnam for writers. Then came the writers who survived the war, and Nguyễn Khai is one of them. And they went into trouble. They got into trouble for saying things like, we suffered during the war. We were not heroes. We were not the guys who were always winning and doing a heroic act. When I went to see him in 1989, he was still being watched by the government, although he'd been a hero in the war. He'd been a soldier who fought both in the war against the Americans and the war with the Cambodians afterwards. But he slipped into my room at 6 o'clock in the morning, slipped me his manuscripts, and ran out before he was arrested, before I was arrested. But those were the conditions still, even with the openness in Vietnam in the post-war years. He wrote a book, and he talked to me, he said, we took care of independence for the people. We fought to gain independence for people, but we don't have independence now. Nobody's taking care of us. We took care of the nation. Now, as veterans, we come back. Nobody's taking care of us. So he questioned a lot of life after the soldiers came back from the Cambodian War. He passed away some years ago, 10 years ago. Lelu, on the other hand, is also one who believed in the war, who fought in the war, he was also a soldier, but he couldn't tell the real story, so he had to write a historical novel that depicted certain things that were still happening in Vietnam, where because the government tells you, you should marry this person, you should do this, that, and the other, everybody had to follow the rules of the party. He used a feudal society in which your parents, your grandparents told you, you need to marry this person, you need to do this and that and the other. So then he depicted people who joined the army because they were told to join the army. Before that, the party and the government told stories about people who volunteered, who happily went to war. He was the first one to say, we don't have a reason to participate in this war, and that the society is changing very fast. We're abandoning Vietnam, went through the revolution, we're abandoning a royalist, a feudal society, but we don't know what we're changing into, and we're not taking care of the people. So his books much later became a movie and got translated into English. And again, I'm choosing a lot of books that are being translated into English to talk to you about this, but there were other writers who wrote post-war. Bao Ninh is probably the most well-known writer in Vietnam still at the moment. He has one book out that is the defining book. It's been compared to All Quiet on the Western Front. It did not deal with the soldiers as heroes, but as victims of all of this. The book is called The Sorrow of War, which is now sold everywhere in Vietnam. Even in photocopied version, it's the most sold book in Vietnam, and everybody knows the story. He still writes, but it's difficult for him. And the thing he said about his book is that, when are you writing your next? He said, look, 500 people died for me to tell that story. Don't ask any more of me. And he's an intense person. It's almost, he's got this crazy look to him. You can't really have a conversation with him. He is one that lives with it and describes PTSD, which is a post-traumatic stress syndrome. He's a bit of an alcoholic now, but he is one of the most thoughtful writers, and The Sorrow of War is one that goes back and forth between the time. It depicts the story of a soldier who went back into the battle to pick up the remains of his former soldiers and relived all of this. Meanwhile, there were some love stories, things that he witnessed. It was outrageous that this was actually allowed to even be published in Vietnam, and then it was banned for a while. Many people from Hollywood have been trying to make the movies, but he's very difficult to work with, and so that has not been made into a movie yet. And there's still talk now about making a movie from this book, but it's been translated in more than 15 languages. So then there's the beginning of women writing about the war. And Dinh Thu Hương is one of them. She was imprisoned for 7 months for depicting the government as a corrupt group of men who took control of the country, who didn't allow dissent, who didn't allow voices to be heard. And she wrote a lot. She started as a journalist and as a film writer, but became this incredible voice. If you read all of her books, you will also understand she has a very dim view of men. Because before that, with the party, it was men, soldiers fighting in the war. But she had a very dim view of people who had no backbones, who did what the state and the government told you to do, and did not stand up to protect their families, to protect society. So all her books are banned. In the year 2000, she announced that she was not come back to Vietnam once she came to the US. And that has given me a lot of trouble, because I was a translator for her at Penn International in New York. And in 2006, I couldn't get back to Vietnam for a while because of my association with her. She's still writing, she's in her 70s, she knows she can't get any money from the government, she doesn't know what to do in Vietnam. She luckily is now living in France, still writing. Also a little bit insane or intense, but you can understand these are writers who deal with these issues for all this time. So if you read anything from the Vietnamese, I would ask you to read Bao Ninh's Sorrow of War and these books. Again, situations in which people couldn't live their life out in peace and couldn't be free to decide what to do with their lives. Nguyen Huy Thiệp is a generation just below Dinh Thu Hương. He's not a soldier. He was sent around as a history teacher. And he's considered the best short story writer in Vietnam. Again, another intense man. One thing he told me, struck me, and I've remembered it for forever, is that when the government allowed them to write, that they were finally free to write, they were like oxen who'd just gotten out of a cage, a cow pen, and they saw everything as a cow. They needed to tell everything, and they wrote about everything. And he can be very brutal. He wrote about kings and decried the authority of the kings, which got him into trouble because he was talking about the government of Vietnam. One of the big stories, The General Retires, is about a general who returns from the war and lives in a society that's changing, that's become more greedy, capitalistic in some ways. And it's brutal, it's horrific. The way that he described it, that the general could not fit back into society. And he was living with his son and his daughter-in-law. And for the daughter-in-law to make money, she was working in an abortion clinic. And she was feeding the fetuses, or the aborted fetuses, to the Rottweiler, the dogs that she was feeding to sell as dogs. And that's how brutal these stories became. But he had to write these stories to talk about how people survived after the war. And the General Retires is a general that all he wanted to do was to go back out into the battlefield and be with his comrades and other soldiers who fought in the war with him. That made sense to him, but new society post-war didn't make sense to him at all. Le Binh Quay was also a volunteer who fought on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. She was finding bombs and detonating them, and she came back as a journalist and writing at that time. And she, like Zun Tin Lun, did not talk about men in very complimentary terms, that the men were weak, that society or the government painted these men as strong heroes in the war, but in fact they were very weak. And she questioned also the revolution in Vietnam with the communist revolution, where there was land reforms and what happened to her own family. She made long stories about the excesses of the Communist Party. She was arrested for a while, kept under house arrest for a while, because she wrote a story in which she described one of the soldiers, the enemy soldiers from the south, as being good looking. For that, she was sent to prison. And she wrote about love. She had a sense of satire, which the New York Times described her. But the greed of the people that she wrote about after the war is an immense story. One story involved a family who was trying to make money. They put the father, who was in a wheelchair, they put the wheelchair out in the street, hoping some cars would run the grandfather over so that they could get the insurance money. The other story is Tony D. It's one we took and made a play out of it in the US. I translated the story and turned it into a play. We produced a play in the US for the US audience, where in the post-war years, the Vietnamese who lived in this house, prostitutes, thieves, and whatnot, laborers, were trying to steal the bones or sell bones to say these are the bones of American soldiers. So they were trying to sell these bones as a way to be allowed to go to the United States or to have the money to survive in the post-war years. Phạm Thị Hoài is probably the most intellectual person that came out of the post-war year. Again, she's a little bit younger than those who fought in the war, but she also was a woman who wrote about women who could not find men. She wrote a short story in Crystal Messenger, if you can read that story. It's about a young girl of 17 living next to her mother, sharing a room with her mother with just a drape between them. And for 7 days, the mother would bring home one man a night, but none of these men was any good. And that the post-war period, which is men did not know what to do with themselves, how to behave, because all they had known was fighting in the war. They were weak men. She became a very critical person on human rights issues in Vietnam. She founded a very strong website, Talavas, to describe some of the abuses of the party. And she's in exile. She lives in Berlin now. She's a librarian, or she studied library science, but probably the most intellectual person of all of them. Poen Thai is also a veteran who fought in the war against China in 1979. His stories have to do with some oddities, some of the odd conditions in the war. We see the women on the island. When all the men went to war, there was an island where all the women lived and fished, And all they wanted was to have a child, but there was no man around. So there was one man who rowed a boat out to that island bringing food and all the supplies to these women, and he became very popular because he had to service these women and addressing the hopes of these women to have a child. The other book, Behind the Red Mist, is a retrospective or a look backwards. So it's a story about a young man who was electrocuted and got sent back to the time where his parents were very young. And then he realized that his parents are not heroes, and the friends and colleagues of his parents were not like what the literature of the days before described them as, heroes who fought in the war. They were just regular people who loved, who hated, who had faults, who were normal people. And with that, we end 10 years of openness in Vietnam, that the renovation period allowed that to happen. But then the critical voices against the party had to stop. The party didn't allow it anymore. And they clamped down, they stopped the people from writing, they stopped allowing these kinds of things to be published. One of the books that came out a period after that is Dumb Luck, which is actually something written in the 30s, but reflects very clearly what Vietnamese society has become now after they've abandoned the ideology, the communism, the wars, the heroes, and have become very selfish and Western-oriented. And that's an important book that came out in recent years. I want to touch upon why these books have been published in English and why they're popular. At that point in 86, 89, 90 to 96, you remember it was the collapse of Eastern Europe. So publishers were looking for the dissident writer, Cuba, North Korea a little bit maybe, China and Vietnam. Publishers looked for it and asked people to start translating these books that came out of Vietnam. It was that popular. And because of the Vietnamese opening up, renovation, there was exposure to the outside, there was tourism that was beginning to happen in Vietnam. People came in, and there was a need for people to read books in English. There were also the American soldiers who had fought in the war in Vietnam, who were now beginning to come back and try to learn about the other. We were talking about the translation issue, or translation panel today, about if these people had read about the Vietnamese, had read Vietnamese books before, they might have had the empathy for the Vietnamese. But it was not until after the war that they came back. But they came back and began translating books by Vietnamese who fought in the war and what they were feeling about the war. And so that and a couple of places in Boston worked with the Writers' Union. A couple of writers didn't want to work with the Writers' Union and became independent people who translated and worked with them. Curbstone Press is one that had a Vietnam Voices and published a lot of those books. Along with that, there were the beginning of American scholars who came to Vietnam in the late 80s, early 90s, who could do research in Vietnam. Before that, nobody knew in Vietnam, nobody could do research. These were the first one. Peter Zinnemann, Michael Di Gregorio, Kim Nin were the first one to meet these writers and translate them, as well as some literary magazines. Of the literary magazines, what was important was the Vietnamese who emigrated to the US at the end of the war and started literary magazines in the States, and they were beginning to be curious as to what happened in Vietnam after they left. So they began to publish stories that couldn't be published in Vietnam. They published them overseas. And then they started putting together anthologies of stories, and that was the beginning of Vietnamese Americans getting involved in writing stories about their own country, about their root countries, or John Ballerman and myself, who'd been involved in Vietnam, wanted to write more and publish more stories that didn't have to do with the war, that had to do with before the war, or that had to do with the war in the South, not the stories from the North, not the communist soldiers, but the Southern soldiers, and our own stories of being in America. Watermark and Once Upon a Dream were such books which told the stories of immigration, of displacement, of being refugees, of the boat people who left Vietnam in 79, 76, and in the years later. So these voices, which Amy will talk more about, ended up being a way to talk about the history of Vietnam, of contemporary Vietnam, but with a different twist. The way they saw it from the South, the way they saw it from the outside, not controlled by the government in Vietnam, and the post-war circumstances of those who left the country. And they talked again of the refugee experience, immigration, exile, and then memory. Because they told the stories of their parents who lived through the war, and the parents who couldn't write in English were now having the children writing about that whole period. My own book was about my father's years of prison. After that, they became a lot more fluent in English, and they became more literary in some ways. There were books set in different places, although it still has the Vietnamese identity or Vietnamese experience, but it could be set in Paris. And somewhat fictionalized. The boat actually is one story about the boat people. The rest of it was set in Colombia, Iran, but all written by Vietnamese writers who used the Vietnamese experience to write about it, and the refugees by Viet Thanh Nguyen. There were a number of women who rose up and became the writers, because writing had always been more of a men's place in Vietnam, but the women, both inside the country after the war and in the US, people like Lam Cao, whose father was a general in the South, and others who wrote about it. So I would ask you to look at these books as well. Again, you may know now that The Sympathizer is one that has won the Pulitzer Prize and other prizes, and has now put Vietnamese literature from Vietnamese living overseas on the map a little bit more. And here you begin to see other themes emerging, transnationalism being both the outsider, the insider, being both Americans, Westerners, or Vietnamese or Asians. This sort of dual identity that became a theme that's very popular now. So to go back to Vietnam, what happened after the years where the communists allowed this openness and then they closed down? They closed down, and a number of young writers in the South, like Open Mouth and Scrap Paper Publishing, started publishing their own books, got into trouble, received some human rights awards, published poetry, translated, photocopied, asked their friends to donate money, and those worked for about 5-6 years, and then Li Dai and Wu Chia have now stopped writing in some ways. And then you start having these celebrity tell-all stories, memoirs of women with their love affairs and blah, blah, blah. Bong Da, it's actually quite interesting, is about Vietnamese tradition on trial, whereas a woman who was just married into a family was finding that at night the portraits of their ancestors came down from the altars and raped her. But sexuality became an issue in the new books. Ngoc Tu is probably the most well-known writer from the very extreme South. There's a bit of nostalgia about life in the South. It doesn't have that much to do with the war, but it's about village life, because Vietnam is fast becoming urban areas, fast adopting capitalism, adopting Western ways. And so Ngoc Tu to me is a reaction to that. And finally, we come to Thuy Hang. To me, is one of the most important voices out of Vietnam. And she is a visual artist. When I approached her and I said, let's do an exhibition of the work of your sculptures and your paintings, I was astounded by the way that she described how the generations before, because they had an ideology and a reason, an excuse to fight in the war, did not take care of the people, did not take care of the environment, and that her generation was living with as victims of these decisions by earlier generations. And she also had sculptures, wire sculptures, bandaged women. Every woman had a child, carrying on the traditional role of the Vietnamese woman and yet accepting a new modern role in Vietnamese society. So with that, I'd like her to take over and talk a little bit more about what she writes about. Thank you, Thúy Hằng. Thank you.
Thank you, Nguyễn Quý Đức, to have a review for us. So it's really good. But I like to talk about something as the writer who was born after the war. Yeah. So in contemporary Vietnam, especially in the Đổi Mới period in 1986, is a very different place from that in which Bảo Ninh wrote The Shadow of the War, and Nguyễn Huy Thiệp wrote Retired General, that Nguyễn Quý Đức mentioned about. Yeah. The field for writing in contemporary Vietnam has been expanded by globalization, and young Vietnamese writers have access to the internet, TV, and social media. So the urban landscape has been transformed by consumerism. So Vietnamese younger generation live postmodern, post-memory lives. They continue to be constantly overlaid with the new narratives and voices. So the French colonial occupation, televised and newspaper images of American Vietnam War creates a post-memory for children of the survivor. So, however, the tendency of the post-memories of Vietnam War and its consequence to the overshadowed significance of the present has been resisted in contemporary literary practice in Vietnam. So, in my opinion, the younger right now see the war as a burden. Yeah, that required them to go back and rediscover and understand it. And most readers now also require writers to address and solve the problem from the war too. They have taken on this responsibility and at the same time have to define their own identity. Writing option to satisfy the needs of the life in modern society, which makes it difficult for a writer to write. Yeah. So, should they go back to shirk the past, or do they have to live and write with their present time? This question will never end in minds of the young writer and cannot answer in a short time. In addition to the war-sensitive topic, today young writers also face with the very difficult state of the censorship. I think right now it's a worst situation right now for the writer. So each book requires a publishing permission, and if the book is involved with politics or sex, the chance of being published is very low. So in the past 10 years, there have been several independent underground publishers who have sneaked out and tried to spread it out. But of course, their readership is very low and often checked by the government. But the mainstream publication in the past 5 years have also been difficult too, because after applying for the publishing permission, the book has not been sold out yet, but must wait to another week for the government to check. So, to making sure the book, if there is a sensitive topic or not, then it will be officially read to the reader. So this makes publishers into difficult because it might affect their business and investment. So as you can see so far right now, so doing this or not, that decision not belong to the writer. Yeah. Therefore, more than ever, the generation of the post-war writers still face with the risk, struggling that even if they write a book about history or about their personal experiences, but it is not certain their story has been properly heard. So this is a problem and harsh situation for most writers before and after the war. The real sad thing is Vietnamese literature in 40 years after the war still walking on a very bumpy road. But I hope that every writer still fight for it and looking for the way out. So it's only a matter of time and their voice will be heard. That's about situation in Vietnam right now.
Well, that's a very hopeful note to end this, that we will sooner or later find a way to have a voice. For those of us who left the country, we don't have the constraint of a government. We have other constraints as to publishing our stories, particularly in a country like in the US, where it was only recently that Asians can really have a voice in publications, on television, in Hollywood, or in anywhere, even with social media. So would you take over, please, Amy?
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Kwan Barry, and I just want to first say thank you to the BLF for organizing this and for bringing authors from all over the world together to have these conversations. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for having me on the panel today. It's true that my participation here, I'm really stretching the concept of the diaspora. So I myself, I was born in Vietnam during the war. I left as a baby at the age of 6 months. I'm half Vietnamese, I'm half black, but I was transracially adopted, and so my family is white. I don't speak Vietnamese, and I was raised in the United States, but my first novel was set in Vietnam, and I've also published books of poetry, and I also deal with Vietnam in my poems. And so in many ways, again, the question of diaspora is a large one, and I think it's important for us to always be asking, you know, what are communities, who are members of communities, what does it mean to be a member of a community, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things I'll say, and then I'll talk briefly again about the challenges Vietnamese Americans are facing in the United States in publishing and what kinds of themes their works are also addressing. One thing I would say is that in many ways, many of the challenges and many of the trends present in Vietnamese American writing is also true for all kinds of immigrant communities. It's not just the Vietnamese Americans. It's true for Cambodians, it's true for example, Nigerians now, who are coming more and more to the United States. It's true for Indian writers. And basically it has to do with the story of how people first come to the United States. They oftentimes write stories about their actual journey from their homeland to the US, and their novels deal with that subject. Then, after about 20 or 30 years, when the children of those people grow up, they begin to write stories about having a foot in both worlds. They write less, again, about the actual journey from the motherland, and more about their coming of age in the United States, and what it means to actually be an American. And then, again, as time passes, they begin to write less and less focused about, again, their ethnicity, and they begin to write stories that have tangentially nothing, obviously, they begin to write stories that are broader in scope and broader in perspective and begin to move outside their communities. And in many ways, this has very much been present in the writings of Vietnamese Americans. So I would say, in thinking about it, it's true that after 1975, when Vietnamese Americans began to become more prevalent in the United States, you can see trajectory in their writings. The first works that I would say had a larger mainstream visibility were works that were primarily memoirs. And so you get memoirs, for example, I have so many things written down here. In 2000, you have Andrew Pham, who wrote Catfish and Mandala. Basically, his memoir was a story about him as a Vietnamese American going back to Vietnam and cycling around the country and seeing various things. You get other memoirs, for example, by Layli Haislip, When Heaven and Earth Change Places. Her memoir, again, was about this idea of her journey from Vietnam to the United States. That was one of the first memoirs to really have a more mainstream impact in the United States, particularly because it was made into a movie starring famous American actors. So in many ways, again, that one really made its mark. In the 2000s, I would say that that was primarily when Vietnamese Americans really began to come on the scene. And again, it has to do with the idea of people coming of age in a certain way. So one of those first memoirs was written actually by a colleague of mine named Beth Nguyen, and it's called Stealing Buddha's Dinner. Basically, she left Vietnam, I think, at the age of 1. The family emigrated and was sponsored by an American church in the American Midwest. There were only maybe 1 of 3 Asian families living in this predominantly white town in the state of Michigan. And so her memoir specifically, it's called Stealing Buddha's Dinner, and she uses the idea of American food as a metaphor for talking about assimilation. And she often contrasts, what it means to have been a Vietnamese immigrant and the kinds of foods that she was used to versus now being in America and the kinds of foods that people ate there. And again, that's her metaphor that she's using with respect to assimilation. And thinking about that, then I would say in the last 10 to 15 years after these memoirs, you get more and more writers who are now writing novels. And they're thinking more broadly about Vietnam in certain kinds of ways. So one of the novels that was referenced before, The Book of Salt by Monique Trong, again, that novel was set actually in Paris. It deals with a Vietnamese man working as a cook for a famous American writer. So you get the idea of themes about what it means to be Vietnamese, but what it means to be Vietnamese, again, in foreign contexts and things like that. Then moving forward, as was discussed, we get other novels. The one that was pointed out, The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen, again, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. It is true that since the publication of that book in 2015, you've just seen a lot more works by Vietnamese Americans. And thinking about it, interestingly, I would say in the last 4 years or so, you see more works by Vietnamese Americans that, again, are much more tangentially related to Vietnam. So, for example, there was a book a few years ago called Dragonfish by an author named Vu Tran. And in that particular book, the main character is white. The main character is actually a policeman, and it turns out that he had been married to a Vietnamese woman, and so that's how and there are other Vietnamese characters in the book as well. But again, you're beginning to get, like I said, Vietnamese authors who are beginning to write from other perspectives and things like that. Interestingly, as I mentioned, and this is true for many immigrant communities, not just for Vietnamese Americans, but the literature tends to move from memoir about the experience of immigration to novels to poetry. And so even though there have always been poets around, it's true that in the last 4 years or so, Vietnamese American poets are really making an impact. The poet Ocean Vuong, here at this festival, I've heard other poets here from around. A poet from Singapore was talking about him, poets from other countries. Because of the internet, a lot of poets in the United States and all over the world are having broader impacts than just in their home countries. And so, interestingly, Ocean Vuong has published one book called Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and I found it really interesting that in the review of his book in the New York Times, and I should say that the New York Times very rarely reviews poetry books, so the fact that this poetry book was even reviewed in the New York Times is really kind of almost unheard of. But interestingly, when they reviewed his book, they compared him to the great American poet Emily Dickinson, and they also compared him to the great British poet Gerald Manley Hopkins. And so I thought it was interesting that they compared this Vietnamese American writer to these very canonical white writers. And so I just found that really interesting, and I think it shows you, again, the journey that Vietnamese Americans have made in thinking about their work. Just a couple of other things I'll mention really quickly, and then just have to do with various challenges that Vietnamese American writers are facing in the U.S. And again, it's not just Vietnamese American writers, but again, writers in any diaspora, writers of color, women, etc. This was something that came up in an earlier panel today, but it has to do with the fact that in the United States, we have a concept of which we call the Great American Novel. And so it's just like, well, what is the Great American Novel? And traditionally, the Great American Novel was a novel that was generally written by a white man, and it had to do with certain subjects. And I think particularly the idea of Viet Thanh Nguyen's novel, The Sympathizer, winning the Pulitzer Prize, really shows you that, again, Vietnamese Americans and, again, immigrants are expanding the notion of what it means to write, quote-unquote, the Great American Novel. So that's something that I think needs to be pointed out. Just one final thing that I'll say in thinking about the future of Vietnamese Americans in the United States. Viet Thanh Nguyen has really positively used a lot of the attention that his winning this prestigious prize has garnished. He's used this attention to positive effects, to trying to bring more visibility to the community. He's also been a co-founder of an organization called Divan, which is, I think, based in California. And basically this organization specifically brings Vietnamese American writers and artists together to talk about what kinds of issues are facing the community and ways to be more prominent outside our community and just more generally in the United States. They've had symposiums in Silicon Valley. I'm actually participating in a symposium in New York in March with this organization. And it's true that when Viet first asked me to be part of this symposium, I was a little hesitant. As I mentioned in the opening, I'm half black, I'm half Vietnamese. It's true that in the United States, people tend to treat me as if I'm only black. People don't tend to think that I'm actually Vietnamese as well. And so this question of just broadening what it means to be of any community, like I said earlier, I think is a really important question that we should all be asking. And I thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much. In just a quick second, we'll take your questions. A couple of things you mentioned. Again, it's not, these themes are not particularly Vietnamese. The immigration to the United States, the adjustment to a new mainstream culture had been explored by Japanese-American writers, Filipino-American writers, and a lot of Indian-American writers as well. The other issue you deal with is a racial thing where you're seen as one group or another. This underlining thing amongst the Vietnamese, and I know this because Viet and I had talked about this. Viet and I actually founded the organization that preceded Divan. It was Ink Blood, and we put plays together, we had readings, we had weekly writing groups working together. One of the themes that happened in those days and afterwards is about sexuality. It's about homosexuality. Amongst those you mentioned, it just occurred to me, there were about 6 or 7 of them who were gay, who had never come out, who had never been able to explore that sexuality, partly because the Vietnamese community, even the Vietnamese American community, is not used to accepting these ideas. So you can see the suppression or oppression that these people felt was doubled. The oppression as people of color in America and of homosexuality. And it seeps into their writing, and it drives them to write. And that's something that I don't think anybody's explored yet, but it's a very clear theme. Some of the characters are gay, but very rarely is it a pronounced issue. But the question of oppression, racism, being boxed in is very clearly in the writings of these people. Let me ask now to take a break and ask if you have questions for our panelists. And let us.
Good afternoon to all of you. It was wonderful listening to all of you. I have been listening for the last 2 days to ma'am, but this is my first session with the other 2 writers, of course. I wanted to know, sir, from you, that as you had mentioned, people turning into laborers, thieves and prostitutes, and selling of bones and skulls of American soldiers. Please enlighten us a bit more about that aspect.
When the Communist Revolution, when the Communists took over part of Vietnam, or all of Vietnam, there was or whenever they did, in various parts of Vietnamese history, they redistributed space. So every family gets to have 10 meters, 5 meters, depending on the number of the people in the family. And then those who don't have a family, they put them in, they'll take an old French villa, which is, say, for 10 people or 6 people. And they would put in maybe 10, 12 families in there, everybody has a little room. And there are a number of stories written about living in common like that, where 100 people would share one bathroom. So then you have people who didn't have jobs, who didn't have proper registration, people who came from the countryside, people who didn't have proper papers, whatever, living together, working in the grey economy, smugglers, and all those people. And Lim and Quay happened to take one of those settings and build a story around the lives of these people. One of them was a thief who went around with this sack with bones. And at that point, the US was beginning to have relationships with Vietnam. And the beginning of the relationship after the war was about finding the remains of American soldiers who'd been left behind in Vietnam. So the US was very focused on that, and all the negotiations for normalizing diplomatic relations with Vietnam depended a lot on how the Vietnamese cooperated. So then at that point in Vietnamese society, American bones became a commodity, became something that if I can find these bones and present it to the Americans, maybe I can sell them, maybe I can get to have a visa to go to the US. And so in this story, the fun part of it, it was difficult to put in play, was that the bones were stolen. After he had it in a knapsack and they discovered they were stolen. Now nobody knows where the bones are. And the Vietnamese are saying, oh God, it's the ghost of the American soldiers who come back and stolen his own bones back. And there were other questions as to who sold it, who took it, and it broke up the relationship between the father and the son who had the bones. And the son was accusing the father of selling the bones, and it was just breaking down of society. So that's the story of a soldier named Tony D.
I don't have a question. I just want to share with you about a novel which is written by an Assamese writer. His name is Birijananda Chaudhary, and the name of the novel is Kekurir Hipare Mukti, and the novel is based on the war. The novel is based on the war of Vietnam. You know, 2 years back, I was in a designated camp for interviewing of some insurgents' families, and they informed me that those novels were used as a text for the insurgents. I think all of you know that Assam also during 90s, though we can't call it a war, but it has faced a long journey of insurgency and resisting the state. So I think I'm quite I have quite similar views like Han has explained that where should we go? Is it the past? Should I write about the past, or should I explain the present? Because my family, because my parents have faced those insurgency movements, and I am just carrying their memories. So even when I try to write, in Assamese, anything, write short stories or any article, it also carries the memory which is transferred from my parents to me. So I think Vietnam is an inspiration also for the insurgent movements. Somewhere, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but as per my information, those texts are also used as an inspiration for this group too. So I think we have shared the same suffering, and we are still, going to the path of struggle as like you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Back in the early 90s, when we were beginning to write, we had the burden of telling the stories of our parents who did not speak English. And the Vietnamese history, recent history, is so rich. We didn't have the English either. We were beginning to write in English. Whereas, say, in India, where you've had circumstances of history where you have people writing in English, for us it was about learning to write and learning to explain it to a mainstream audience that had very particular ideas of the Vietnam War. So I'm glad to hear that there are other places where this is an inspiration. So grateful to hear that. Roland, did you have a question?
I don't know who was first, so I have to give him after.
So thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation and very insightful, both of you. I'm a Tibetan refugee living in India, and like Amy, there are a number of Tibetans today living in America, mixed, and also of Tibetan heritage. And they have their own issues of identity. How do they recognize themselves? However other people call them. But how do they negotiate their own identity? And what makes it, or does the self-identification change over a certain time? Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about how you feel as a Vietnamese or American, or what part calls you this, or has it changed over a certain time? Yeah, it's a personal question, but I think these are essential questions as a writer about your own identity. Yeah, and to you, one small question: the negotiation of the past and the pain, and how you forgive the enemy and yet not forgetting and continuing to write about it. How does today's Vietnam look at America led by Donald Trump, where what America did in Vietnam, today America is doing in other countries? And in my country, what Vietnam had undergone is what China is doing in Tibet today. So I'd like to hear from you, how do people look at that? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's one of the big ones, right? Self-identity, like who are you? Like it really doesn't get bigger than that. And I have jet lag, but I will do my best. So in thinking about it, right or wrong, I do believe that much of our identity is defined by our communities. It's defined by who's around you. It's defined by how they define you. Again, right or wrong. But I feel that the act of writing, that the act of art making is an opportunity to self-define in many ways. So for me, as I mentioned, in the United States, I am seen primarily as a Black American woman. And so through my writing, through research, through travel, I've been able to come to an understanding for myself of what it means to be Vietnamese. I don't speak Vietnamese. Obviously, I don't have the same kinds of stories as other people. I will also, in the same time, it kind of touches on your second question having to do with Donald Trump. So for example, before 2016, in the American election, I never thought of myself as a refugee. I always thought that refugee stories are very particular. Refugees are usually people who've come through fire and hell to reach a place of safety. I was 6 months old, I got on a plane, I have no memory of it, and so I had never identified as a refugee. I'd always identified as an immigrant, but not as a refugee. But after the election of Donald Trump, I realized it's very important for me to identify as a refugee, because many Americans don't have a sense of, in their mind, refugees are only a certain kind of person. You know, and so it's important for people to realize, no, refugees come in all shapes and sizes, they have all kinds of accents, they sound American, they have all kinds of stories. And so, like I said, the culture might define me another way, but through my writing, that's how I'm able to self-identify and to decide who I want to be. So.
I think it's an important question. And now that I have, I left my country when I was 17, and I have some 40-some years to look back upon this experience, then I realized a number of things happened that made my identity change, as you mentioned. First of all, we are defined in some ways by others and by ourselves that we're victims. We're victims of war. We're victims of circumstances of history. When I came to the US, that was what I wanted to tell people, that we're victims, and yet at the same time I fought that whole notion that I'm a victim, that I wanted to be like everybody else. I could do a number of things. I could learn English, take a job, and so that was a struggle for all of us. And all of that became inspiration for writing. Then once I got there, I began to have other friends from the Japanese community, from the Hawaiian community, from other Asians, Filipinos. And I go, oh wow, I don't have to be a victim of the Vietnam War. I can be a victim of anything else that had happened to the Chinese, the Chinese Exclusion Act, to what happened in that country to Asians. And then I became a victim of people of color. Then I started saying, oh, why am I the only person of color in this room when everybody else is white? Why can't there be more people of color? Then I began to see my problems more universal, bigger issues. And in the case of Vietnam in particular, the Vietnamese saw themselves as victims of the Cold War. Communism versus the free world, if you will. Then we came to America and we began to understand, oh, a black person had to fight to get onto a bus and be allowed on the bus and be allowed into areas. For us now, other people of color, to do that and to run for office and to become president or whatever. But it took these other people, and it took out the context of the Cold War, and it took into consideration the civil rights movements in the States. So my identity changed, which became very difficult for American society to place me. Are you black? Are you Asian? Are you people of color? I mean, what are you? And I mean, no, I'm an American, and the way I do it, also, I insist on pronouncing my name the Vietnamese way in the US. And they go, but God, you know, the Vietnamese accent is very difficult you have your family name first and your first name after. And I go, but you realize you've asked me to learn all the Italian, Irish, and whatever else names, Smith, Molinari. You now learn to say Nguyen the way it should be, because that's a Vietnamese name that has become a part of America. So we write about these things. These are inspiration when we have to be both an American and someone else. And that is the question. Now then, once we live there, we have overcome our wounds from the war. We begin to think roots. My identity is as a Vietnamese person. I left the country when I was 17, and I never felt complete. That my life got there and I had to be somebody else. Now I want to go back and complete that life. So I came back knowing very well I had changed, but also the country has completely changed. Culturally, socially, economically, and I had to fit back in. So in the end, I never fit in the US, I never fit in Europe, I never fit in anywhere. So I write about these things. And how do I overcome this? And people say, Duc, you know, your father was put in prison for 12 years by the communists. You did not have your father for 16 years. How do you go back and live in a communist country? How do you live in Hanoi? And there are two things. One, you have to look at, I begin to look, well, Vietnam is my country. Whether it's communist or it was, or it's changing, or capitalist, it's still my culture. I have to accept that. I don't like a lot of the things that's happening in the country, but it's not my right to do anything. If I wanted to have that, to have a sense of community, to have friends, to speak my own native language, then I have to be there and accept it. And yet, you hope that you have a chance to say what's wrong and to express to people, this is how I view it, both as the insider in Vietnam and outsider. So in the end, I'm an outsider and insider in both of these places. The other thing you mentioned as well is, how do we write about this? Because we're boxed in. I could walk into any publisher's office and they go, okay, write to me about the war. Did you see combat? Did you kill anybody? I said, no, I want to write about my time in Morocco. I spent a lot of time there. I've been going, Morocco. Why do you want to write about Morocco? Because I live there. But no, I cannot be seen as a Moroccan or have any understanding. And I go, no, they were colonized by the French. They suffered it. We have the same sort of cultural attributes. What kind of writing? No. Either you write about the Vietnamese being a victim or you don't. It's very difficult in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Nguyen, for this fantastic introduction to post-war Vietnamese literature. I didn't even know that we have so much in common. I'm Hungarian, actually. Half Hungarian, half Serbian. I came from I was born in ex-Yugoslavia, but live in Hungary. And we have many similar questions about the post-war experience. And I'm very happy, according to your speech, that in America, Vietnamese writers are recognized, as far as I'm concerned from this talk. And so the institutions, you are in the institutions canonized, they write about your work. And my question is, but before I put my question, I will tell you my example. So when we think about ex-Yugoslavian civil war, we think about Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, Kosovo, Albanians, etc. We don't have that in mind that those who were born in northern part of Serbia, in Vojvodina, Hungarians were also involved by force. It was not their war. The Serbs and Croats hated each other, but the Hungarians were forced to go into that war, to serve Croatian army or to serve Serbian army. In the period of war, Europe was very interested into that war. So those writers who were writing about that war, Serbs, Croats, were translated into the German and the other languages and were recognized by institutions, etc. Hungarian writers were not, because simply there was not a focus on that, they were even Hungarians fighting in that war. So those writers, Hungarians who emigrated from Hungary to from Serbia to Hungary, were not recognized outside of Hungary. My generation, we started also to write about these war stories. Of course, with the reflection that these stories are not ours. Those stories are like oral stories, like legends. For us, it's like legends, actually. But we are not in fashion anymore, so we are recognized by the Hungarian institutions. I mean, they're, so to say, canonized. They write about us, etc. We got some prizes, but the market didn't bring us to the readers. So the readers are not interested in Hungary, in our works. My question is, you are recognized as a Vietnamese writers, and what about the market? Did the American readers buy your books?
Well, with Vietnamese book and Pulitzer, I'm sure there's a kind of reaction to Vietnamese writing. But I want to go back to your thing as well, which relates to this. You were talking how the Tibetans see themselves and their identity in Tibet. I'm pretty sure that they will soon get very tired of people walking up to a Tibetan and wondering, are you Buddhist? Buddha, Buddha, the China, Buddhist, Tibet. And you would begin to write, oh, but we do something else. We have sex, we eat this, we love, we hate, just like anybody else. It's the box that we're put in, right? So once you allow yourself into that box, then it's easier for people to buy your books. As a radio producer reporting about Asia, one of the things that I reacted against were actually Asian writers who put themselves in those boxes. Those who wrote about the mystery of the geisha, and the empire, and the gold, the silk, the mother-daughter stories, the kitchen, the dragon. Because those are the stereotypical images that the outside world think of us. Those are the books that become very popular. And yet, without those books, other books about real experience of our community wouldn't be touched upon. And yet, there are Vietnamese now saying, oh, Viet is writing for a white audience. Viet Pulitzer book responds to the need of a white audience or a mainstream audience or the outsider looking into our community. But we're much more than that. His book is still about the war.
And just really quickly, I would add to also in thinking about your question, I only recently discovered, my agent actually told me, which I hadn't known. She's, so my first book came out, it was reviewed in many newspapers, the New York Times, etc., etc. But it's true that it did not sell that many copies, or what have you. And my agent was like, well, of course, they really weren't expecting it to sell that much, because my book, A, is not set in the United States, and B, it has no white characters in it. And so it was the idea that's understood, but I appreciate the fact that my publisher was still willing to give it a chance. I told her my second book is set in Mongolia and has no white characters in it, and they were like, wow, yeah, okay, so it happens. But it's true that as far as the audience is concerned, and that's something that we just have to work on more. I do think, though, that if you look at, so for example, I started writing in the late 1990s, and when I started writing, there were very few models of writers of color for me to look at and to emulate. But I can say in the last 30 years now, there are more and more and more. And I have to believe, the United States, they say by maybe 2040 will be a majority brown culture. I'm not sure I get what year, if it's 2040 or 2050, where it will be a white minority. And so I think it is just a matter of time, but I'm also a big believer in the idea that when it comes to publishing, we need to have women, we need to have people of color who are actually editors, who are actually in the positions to give somebody that chance to publish their work.
There are other ways that we try to find ways to get our voice out there. You were talking about poetry being high art, and the publisher on your panel was talking about, or on the other panel, was talking about how there's money out there to publish poetry, and I want to take that money and publish poetry. I don't have any trouble with that sort of thing, with those statements. My issue is once we place it in high art, and we place it with money, then we've cut out the rest of our readers who normally would not be exposed to this. What we did in San Francisco was we took poems that we thought talked to the average person who rode the bus, who didn't have cars, We didn't have time to read poetry. We stuck it inside buses. What do you do when you sit in a bus for 10 minutes or 20 minutes? Rather than them reading advertisement for cars or washing machines, we gave them poetry. We got the money from elsewhere, but we got the people involved in reading poems, and we added photographs of their lives that touched them. And in that way, you have to figure out ways to get into the people in the streets of America, not in the bookstores, not in the bookshelves in the airport where the average person with the money to travel will read. Because they'll read about the geishas and the women of the silk, the stereotypical things. Now I'm sitting here thinking, because of all those years that we fought to have the real voices of Asian Americans, or real voice, any voices of Asian Americans and people of color, now the pendulum is swinging back the other way, and there's a reaction against it, and that's why we have now Make America Great Again, which is, you know, Make America White Again. Let's take one question.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask that because of the fact that Vietnam also has a colonial history, so do you guys see the post-war literature as also a post-colonial literature, or do you see that post-colonial literature is like, you know, I mean, is beyond post-war literature? So I want you to talk about that. Thank you.
I think about this a lot. I think about it because I'm concerned with the arts and the writing inside Vietnam. But we don't write about it. We're so concerned with the war. We're so concerned with current daily life and the difficulties and the struggles we have now, that we don't have the luxury to look back at the post-colonial. And I think of Afghanistan, and I think of Brahmaputra in Indonesia, and I think of Salman Rushdie, that already there are those stories out there. The problem now inside Vietnam is that the arts and literature is being supported. If any support comes from the outside, it comes from Europe. You know, the countries in Europe pay a lot more attention or have a lot more money. But I think the Vietnamese ought to go to India, ought to go to Algeria, ought to go to Morocco and Indonesia to learn the lessons and to talk and share. So I'm happy to hear that people are going to Jogja. I'm happy to hear, you know, I'm grateful to be here, to begin to read and see the books in translation and see that history, whether it's Jamaica or South America. And I always complain that the Vietnamese in America did not look at the Filipino and the Japanese in the very beginning. They didn't, because they were so stuck with their own history and their own country right there and then, but they can't look in the larger context. But I think we have a lot to learn. Unfortunately, if we came to the Indian embassy, the Indonesian embassy in Vietnam, or Algerian, they don't have any money to bring us to Algeria or Morocco. It's through private affairs. There's a bit more in contacts with South Korea, Japan, beginning Indonesia, some in Malaysia. There's a couple of festivals the Vietnamese participated in. But I'm afraid we're still isolated, and we need to get out to be able to look at our own history through learning other histories.
Thank you, sir. History has demonstrated that most notable winners usually encountered heartbreaking obstacles before they triumphed. They won because they refused to become discouraged by their defeats. Thank you, distinguished speakers, for sharing your precious knowledge and inspirational story and enlightening our guests with the Vietnam culture and literature. Thank you, dear guests and audience, for your involvement and willingness to learn and be a part of the 3rd Literary Festival. Thank you. I would like to request our guests to stay back because we have another session for the day. Thank you.